So understanding that MBTI is built upon Carl Jung's work, how do you justify Katharine Briggs and Isabel Myers' lack of academic background within psychology?
How do you justify? Sorry, go. I started talking about looking to see who was talking. How would you justify the opportunities available to women in the 1940s and 1950s to become academic psychologists? Might be one answer to that. I'll throw out further answers.
Well, taking off on that, if you go back in time, we actually looked at statistics for women who had education in that time period, and they were in the 1% of females who had higher education in that time period. So even though they weren't psychologists and weren't PhDs, they were highly educated people for the time period. I will also say that Isabel was notorious for reaching out. Kesstan alluded to or mentioned the relationship with the AMA, so, with medical doctors. Isabel had relationships with academics throughout the United States and possibly even other countries. And when we were doing some work on a different variant of the MBTI and went into the archives, found, letters where she was corresponding with a person who was, the cutting edge person for factor analysis. So she was a self-taught statistician. She didn't learn it in academia, perhaps, but she learned it from academics on her own. And that actually says a lot about her persistence and perseverance and her intelligence, frankly. So I think that's a really false argument brought against type, or Isabel and Katharine, is that, they weren't educated, they weren't psychologists. But you have to look at it in time and in place. And the stuff that's not known by most people is how hard she worked to become highly educated just outside of an academic institution.
I have something to add to that as well. First, just building on what Rich said, Katharine and particularly Isabel, throughout decades of doing research on this, did do research and collaborate with MDs and PhDs and academics that had national status. Education Testing Service was full of psychometricians, PhD psychometricians. So she did her research and development of this with it. She connected with Mary McCauley, who was a tenured professor at the University of Florida in the 60s. She was a psychologist, which was unheard of for women back then. And they had a research lab at the University of Florida called the Type Lab, and they did a lot of research. So what Rich is saying is true. Isabel did work with academics and did work with educated people. But I've always found this criticism of Katharine and Isabel not being PhDs sort of interesting, particularly in America, where we love the maverick outsider. We love entrepreneurs, the amateurs who come in and upend everything, right? We love that. And that is what Isabel was. She came in from the outside. Often amateurs and outsiders can see things and are willing to take risks and pursue things that others who are embedded in a field that has more do's and don'ts and shoulds are not willing to pursue. And I've just always found that criticism interesting, considering, our national culture. We love that kind of maverick who questioned how things are done and came up with something that upended everything. So in spite of the fact that Isabel and Katharine didn't have PhDs, they created a global phenomenon. So I guess maybe you don't need one.
Just picking up on that, Kesstan, because that's an argument I hadn't quite heard before, put that way very eloquently. There is, of course, other research outside the world of type which suggests that sometimes female mavericks are treated rather differently to male mavericks.
Yes.
And that may have something to do with it as well.